Hi everyone, my name is Greg Schreiner and I work at the CSIR Stellenbosch offices in a group called Environmental Management Services, which is in the Smart Places cluster. And our job at EMS is to design and implement integrated and innovative environmental assessment processes. So today I'm going to talk to you about the process that we ran in Saldanha Bay, where we undertook a risk and resilience assessment for the local municipality in partnership with Provincial Government Western Cape. First off, I'd like to acknowledge Provincial Government Western Cape for funding the project and for also contributing significant human resources to the project. I'd also like to thank my colleagues from the CSIR project team, as well as a host of other report co-authors from a diversity of South African institutions. So some background to the study and the study area. The Greater Saldanha Bay Area, or the GSB, it's been identified as a hub for future blue and green economies. And this really provides an opportunity for the region to transition away from more traditional industrial brown economies. But at the same time, the region is very well known for its biodiversity hotspots, which support key socio-economic sectors in the region like agriculture, tourism and fisheries. And as such, development in the GSB region is actually rather constrained. And as such, it requires rather smart thinking around what sustainable development in the future might look like. So at the moment, through Operation Pakisa and various other national planning imperatives, there are a host of projects, plans and policies proposed in the region. Some projects include gas importation, aquaculture development zones, phosphate prospecting activities, crude oil storage, and many other projects are proposed in the region. Localized decision-making tools like environmental impact assessment aren't necessarily the best for looking at cumulative risk and ecological change. What we really attempted to do in this risk and resilience assessment was build in the idea of cumulative risk over a 5 to 10 year timescale in order to assist strategic level decision making. The origin and purpose of the assessment, well, in 2017, the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning at the Western Cape Government, DEA and DP, approached the CSIR, and fundamentally they wanted 3 questions answered. How close is existing natural capital to thresholds or limits of acceptable change? Which features of that natural capital will be exposed to excessive risk in the next 5 years? And how can government integrate long-term decision-making and monitoring into some sort of coherent framework? So fundamentally, their question is well displayed in this image from the IPCC, which shows in the column on the left our world, which is exposed to multiple internal social and ecological stresses, and at the same time it's exposed to multiple external stresses. And the idea then, when you look at the column in the middle, is that there exists an opportunity space for decision makers and society at large to make resilient decisions. In other words, following the green path up to a possible future which is higher in resilience and lower in risk. So we couch this risk and resilience assessment within the conceptual framework of ecosystem services. And ecosystem services is a concept that's been well used over the last 15 years or so. And our first job was to really look how ecosystem services currently underpin human well-being in the Saldanha Bay Municipality. And it wasn't a great surprise to find that ecosystem services fundamentally underpin virtually all socioeconomic sectors in the region. In order to model the interactions between humans and the environment, we adopted the DIPSA model for society-environment interactions. Basically, we used drivers being economic sectors, pressures being activities and infrastructure which either consume, alter, emit, preserve or destroy, and impacts to natural capital, all of which feed into the concept of human well-being, which feeds back into drivers and economic sectors. Using that DIPSAR methodology, we developed a very large aggregated socio-ecological model. So this diagram on the presentation is not meant to be legible, but it provides an indication of how various features and variables in the system interact with one another, whether they're drivers, pressures, or impacts. We built this model using literature reviews and a number of meetings with the Project Steering Committee, the Intergovernmental Task Team, various stakeholder forums, and from specialist inputs. But very large aggregated models like that are not necessarily useful. They can't even be well presented on a PowerPoint presentation. But so our next task was to disaggregate the socio-ecological model. And we did this by identifying what we termed impact strings, where drivers and pressures resulted in material impacts to ecosystem services. So we identified 7 key impact strings: air quality deterioration, loss of terrestrial biodiversity, loss of marine biodiversity, and so forth. For each of those impact strings, we developed impact string diagrams, or my colleague who generated the diagrams, Luanita, she called them peacock diagrams. And basically what the diagrams show, along the top where you can see the colors, are the various sectors and subsectors, each feeding into pressures, which are underlined in the diagram, ultimately cascading into what we have termed an impact. And you can also see feedback loops from the impact running back up to the sectors and the subsectors. So these disaggregated impact strings were developed for each of the 7 key impacts that we identified from the bigger socio-ecological model. Then a collection of integrated author teams were assigned to each of the 7 key impact strings. And their job was to look or assess the risk and resilience of the various interactions of the impact strings. And so we used a likelihood multiplied by consequence approach to determining risk, and risk was assessed with and without mitigation. The assessment approach ultimately depended on considering risk in relation to resilience, and the interface between risk and resilience being the concept of a threshold, and a threshold being the boundary between subjectively an undesirable state versus subjectively a desirable state. And what exists in between those two states is the opportunity for various intervention measures to drag the socio-ecological system or pull the socio-ecological system, or encourage it rather, in either direction. So with these multiple impact strings and multiple specialist teams assessing the impact strings between drivers, pressures, and impacts, what we essentially did was around 260 mini risk assessments, and these were tabulated in very large Excel spreadsheets, and they were undertaken across the DIPSAR model. And what we also did was integrate GIS-based spatial sensitivity into the DIPSAR model, which I'll speak to later. But we had these huge tables which weren't necessarily user-friendly for stakeholders or for the client. And so my colleague Luanita, she developed these risk diagrams. And what they are essentially are large images, and they show spatially explicit sensitivity regions, they show natural capital features, they show the pressures, and they show the risk rating without mitigation, and then they show the risk rating with mitigation. And I'll show you an example of the risk diagrams that were developed as part of the process. So these risk diagrams were developed for each sector, each driver of change currently operating within the GSB. Because the risk assessments were spatially explicit, it was possible to develop a risk mapping profile. And so what we were able to do was integrate or transpose the risk assessments into a landscape model which showed an evolving risk picture over various scenarios of change, 5 to 10 years into the GSB future. And then critically, because we ran so many mini risk assessments, it was possible to consider risk in a cumulative sense. And this helped us to develop ecosystem service thresholds, which was the key output that the client was looking for at the end of the day. So we used a concept called the maximum rule, whereby each risk, a certain feature of the system, if it had 4 risks, for example, and 3 risks were low or medium, but 1 risk was especially high, then that feature would be assigned at high risk. So this is not a perfect methodology, but it's the one most often applied to cumulative risk assessment. And using the maximum rule methodology, we determined really that the GSB ecosystem services threshold are coming close to their limits for marine aquatic biodiversity and ecosystem services and surface water. This is not to say that development which ultimately impacts those ecological systems can't proceed in the future. What it does mean is that any development which does proceed and which doesn't adhere to strict environmental quality standards should be considered to be breaching the limits of the system. And if the limits of the system are breached to a large extent, we can expect that to ultimately impact human well-being in the medium to long term. Another key output that the client was looking for was an integrated socio-ecological decision-making and monitoring framework. And so what you can see on the screen here, the grey boxes are the key pressures currently in the socio-ecological system feeding into natural capital features, ultimately feeding into ecosystem services and then human well-being. And the essence of this diagram is that if there's suitable monitoring of features in the grey boxes against the quality standards that we set out in the report, at least theoretically, you should be moving the system towards a more desirable, resilient state. It's impossible to say whether that's the case affirmatively, but that's at least theoretically what we predict. So the key points of learning and way forward from the process, well, very few current environmental assessment tools are really equipped to assess cumulative risk in complex socio-ecological systems. So what we had to do for this pilot study was rather innovative and bespoke, and a number of things worked really well, and a number of things can be certainly improved upon in the future. And to that end, our group EMS has been allocated 4.5 million Rand in PG funding over the next 3 years to really hone our systems modeling and assessment capacity. We believe that these kind of tools are an essential component for realizing the sustainability objectives of the National Development Plan at national scale and then at global scale for the Sustainable Development Goals. And our client, DEA and DP, they agree with us, and we're currently in the process of collaborating with them on phase 2 of this project. And ultimately, phase 2 of the project will begin to populate that integrated decision-making and monitoring model that we put together, populating it with real data so that there's a very quick feedback between decision-making and projects which are implemented on the ground. Thank you very much, everyone, for the time to present to you. And if there are any questions, please feel free to direct them to me or to my email, which I'll put up at the end of the presentation.